this is, you know, you have a very long neck, right? Which,
Yeah.
yeah, so does Joan.
I think, I don't think that's, I don't think that's got anything to do with it. I know people with really long necks who don't have any issues. I know people who play like this who don't have any issues. The position, your structure, the position of the violin and the interface, i.e. the chin and shoulder rest combination, is only part of it. You can have no neck and be absolutely built for playing the violin. You can be really strong and fit and still have issues. And I've had all sorts of people over all those years with all the different instruments. I've had people who were physically really suited to it, have had really good teaching, had, you know, they've been to specialist music schools, had fantastic teachers right from the beginning. Sometimes even people who've had it's rare in violin playing, but who've had somebody set them up with the right sort of chin rest and shoulder rest for their structure, and they've still got problems. So it's not to do with that. It's part of it, but it's only one of the many factors involved. So for me, I actually don't think it was an issue.
I totally agree that it's that you can play violin well with any kind of neck, and you can play badly with any kind of neck. But I will say this, that the longer neck you have and the less broad shoulders you have, you have much more opportunity for error.
Yeah.
You know? So that's
it's much more difficult trying to sort out somebody's playing who isn't built for it. And particularly if somebody who's pulling the shoulders round and the shoulders are like that, you know, if they're sloping.
Yeah. And I changed a little bit my questions based on something that you just said earlier in the interview. But it's interesting that you said that you recruited the violinists for your study by putting an ad in the Performance Arts Medicine, which tells me that all the violinists that reported for it and volunteered for it did so probably because they already had some problems.
I know where you're coming from. When I said it was an advert with BAPAM, they distributed the advert, but it actually went to different music colleges and different orchestras, and it wasn't really, I've got the advert somewhere. I sort of printed it off because I figured somebody would ask me about this. Would you like, the advert was violin and viola players, would you like to find out more about how to optimize your playing? So actually the issue of problems weren't even in the ad, because I knew that would be, I knew that would be a confounding variable. And actually when it came to the study, there were people who had come because they had problems, but there were a lot of people who didn't have problems. They were just really interested to find out more about it, or some people came because they obviously had some altruistic vein in them. They wanted to help out. So I actually had a whole spectrum. I know 21 people isn't very many, but actually it's quite enough in terms of a lot of the studies that were done in performing arts medicine. So I kind of I was already onto that one because of all the work I'd done in BAPAM and all the reading I'd done. So yeah.
So yeah, so the question actually is, so when you had all this, because it says in your research, when I was reading it, that everybody basically had the same problems, like, you know, what the violinists do when supporting and playing the instruments. Do all of them do the same thing? And was there any, you know, sort of talk? Did you ask them questions in terms of, you know, I mean, I ask my students always the same question, like, how do you hold the violin? Which, you know, interestingly, their answer is how they actually think they're holding the violin, and not necessarily how they're holding the violin, but, you know, how do you produce sound? You know, and, you know, with those two questions, I find out really a lot, right? So before I even see them play, right? And when I see them play, I it sort of helps me see, are they doing what they think they're doing, kind of thing. So when you did this research, did you answer some of this question, and did you notice that everybody's basically doing the same stuff to the same extent, or?
Yeah, so I didn't have that discussion with them. I didn't ask them if they knew how they held the violin and how they produced the sound. I don't think I've really ever asked a student that, because I can tell as soon as they pick up the violins. But the answer is yes, they all did the same thing, but to slightly different degrees. So what we know in the Alexander technique is that there is an underlying pattern of general misuse that everybody exhibits to a greater or lesser extent, regardless of what they do. So because we're all built to the same model, you know, we've all got the same basic anatomy and physiology, even though we all look very different, we're all different shapes and sizes. We all have a tendency, or all humans have a tendency to learn to generate more muscular tension than they need just to keep themselves upright. And that's something that's learned by trial and error from when we're really, really young. And it just becomes part of what we are, who we are, what we do in everyday life. And it comes about partly because of learning, but it also comes about because of the way that we react in different situations. So if you learn the Alexander technique and if you come to teach it, that sort of becomes a given in a way. You just have to, that's something that I accepted about myself very early on. I could see it. I could understand that I was using more muscular effort than I needed to just to stand and sit, let alone do anything else like play the violin, and that I wasn't aware of what I was doing because all of that had just become so much who I was and what I did that I wasn't aware of it. So like any constant, after a bit you stop noticing it because it's just a constant thing. So there's a sort of general lack of awareness that we have, and that then ties over. But what I was going to say is that there is a pattern. So the pattern is that we stiffen the muscles of the neck, we pull the head backwards and down, we shorten and narrow the back, and we brace the knees. And that's a general underlying pattern that you, as an Alexander teacher, as an Alexander student, you begin to observe in other people and yourself. And as a teacher, what you're doing is teaching people to observe that in themselves and maybe in other people if it's helpful, and teaching them to let go. And that's what I do in my classes. Now, on top of that general pattern, which is going on all the time, there is then additional things. What my colleague at the Conservatoire, Roy, he calls added extras, so add-ons. So for the violin, but basically what happened was that as people picked up the violin, they sort of swung the violin round, they pulled the shoulder forwards and up towards the violin, and generally they pulled the head and the neck forwards and down onto the instrument. As they did that, they also rotated anteriorly to the right. I can't think of the right jargon now, but basically they moved the torso to the right and sort of twisted themselves. There was also a tendency to bend back from the waist. So as people lift their arms up, they kind of do that to counter the waist, the
way back, yeah.
weight. But because they're stiffening the legs, they won't go back from the whole of from the head, from the feet to the head. They bend back at the waist, as you say. And there's a tendency to pull themselves forwards over the ankles and to stiffen the knees. And we could actually see that in all the participants. And I mean, people do other things as well. I mean, so quite a lot of players, they pull. I have really long legs for my height. I'm only about 5 foot, well, I've shrunk now, but I used to be 5'8", I'm about 5'7" now. But I've got really long legs. So I've got a problem when I sit down in that I bang my knee. And a lot of players have that as well. So they often get around that by rotating and sort of bowing behind them as well. So there's also things going on with the right arm. There's a tendency to raise the shoulder and also pull the right arm back. So there's just a whole gamut of things that you can actually see, and those are what we're able to measure. So when I'm teaching students, I kind of know now. I mean, I began to see it when I looked at my own self, when I was looking at my own playing, but in my teaching, I just began to see it more and more. So in our experiments, that's what we measured. And we didn't know whether we'd be able to measure it at all, but we could. Did I actually answer your question? Damajo? Did I actually?
Yeah. I mean that's like I said, I'm looking at this through sort of just violin technique, from violin technique perspective, right? So I was just wondering, because if everybody's doing the same things, that sort of makes me think they all rest on the same principles. So if you ask them these questions, what do you hold the violin with? The answer a lot of the time would be neck and shoulder.